Hi, everyone. I'm Leslie Cornwell with Midwifery Business Consultation. This next amazing interview we have today with Moira Tannenbaum. She is an expert in governmental midwifery advocacy across the country. She's practiced in many states, and she is on a couple of our national boards. So I'm very excited to have Moira here today. Moira is a midwife in the Midwestern state, and she serves the ACNM State Government Affairs Committee and serves on the American Association of Birth Centers as a vice president for government affairs and membership. So we are very fortunate to have her. She has 2 adult children, one born at home and one at the hospital. So I'm very excited. We're going to dig right into the government politics. Is there anything I should add more, Moira, about your expertise?
I wanted to say that both my kids were caught by midwives, of course, right?
Yes. I apologize for not adding that. That's very important. Yes.
That's okay. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I want to say that I don't think anybody goes into midwifery to become a legislative advocate. And so I certainly didn't. But along the way, I've learned a lot from a lot of midwives. And so I hope to share some of what I've learned and give you some ideas going forward and reflect on also how much learning I still have to do. It's an ongoing process.
Oh, we're all continuous learners.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
So the first question, just giving everybody a backdrop, where's your background? How did you get involved in midwifery politics?
Yeah, so I graduated in 2009 and I took a job in a birth center in a very restrictive state and had really no idea of the state regulations. And I certainly didn't learn that in school. In fact, some of what I learned in school, particular to my state, turned out to be wrong. But I was an ACNM member and I had started that in school. So I went to an ACNM affiliate meeting and somebody was requesting, oh, we need a midwife to step up and attend some statewide nurse meetings. And I thought, well, I could do that. But since I worked in a birth center and felt very much like an outlier in terms of other nurse midwives, I checked to make sure it would be like, okay, if I went and tried to represent nurse midwives as an outlier nurse midwife working in a birth center. And I was told, yeah, sure, of course. So I started attending these quarterly meetings and I really had no idea what I was doing, but I just tried to, get there early and be friendly and take notes and be approachable. And I was lucky to be able to sit with another nurse midwife, the only other one on this committee, and she was there representing the State Board of Nursing. And she became a mentor to me and taught me a great amount. I would say probably half the time I had no idea what the group was even discussing. I just literally didn't understand the words. And that made me realize that when you start being a midwife advocate or when you know that you're working with somebody new, don't let them be in that situation. I mean, give them a vocabulary sheet, do something. So that's how I started out. And I just progressed from there. Started understanding what was going on in the discussions and then looking for more opportunities that I could do things. I started responding to when ACNM would send out a legislative request, like, please, can you send this letter to your Congress people? I would do that and I would start personalizing it with my experience and just kept on from there.
Awesome. Very, very excited. I think just one of the examples you gave when we did our earlier discussion last week was the example of just one little discussion can make a cascade of events, talking to doctors, talking to clients, I think sometimes midwives think, oh my gosh, I don't want to be in politics. I don't want to be a chairperson. But those little examples you gave last week were amazing for inspiration to help midwives realize they can make bigger change.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's been important to me is like realizing what I'm good at and what I'm not good at. And so I was an editor before I was a midwife. I love writing. I love the written word. I love reading. And so a few years after this birth center experience in the restrictive Midwestern state, I was in a more southern state that was fighting for full practice authority and had full practice authority. By that I mean midwives and perhaps other advanced practice nurses, also certified professional midwives who are usually legislatively in a different category. But full practice authority for the advanced practice registered nurses was a legislative bill at that time in that state. And people had been trying to pass that bill for either 9 years or 12 years, depending on who you listen to. So I was working at a small hospital with another midwife. We had started the practice and we were treated really terribly and spent a lot of our time trying to advocate and bringing policies and saying, hey, actually we shouldn't need to do X, Y, and Z because we're midwives and we blah, blah, blah. So we spent a lot of time trying to assert for midwifery. And then the plug was pulled on that practice right at the time that the short legislative season in that state was just getting going. And so I realized, like, A, I'm really, really mad about what happened to us midwives, and B, it's the perfect time to jump in and try to get this bill passed, because I thought that getting full practice authority would raise the status of nurse midwives and the other APRNs in that state and would be beneficial. So I jumped in and said, kind of like, what can I do? And I noticed that they were collecting impact stories from other advanced practice nurses. People were submitting stories about how has the lack of full practice authority affected you and your patients personally. And midwives and nurse practitioners and nurse anesthetists and one clinical nurse specialist were submitting their stories, but I found their stories really hard to follow, and I didn't see a theme. And then I thought, well, I'm an editor. This is what I do. I can make the stories approachable, and I can weave themes and group them. And so with everybody's permission, that's what I did. And we made an impact packet of stories that then was given to the legislators. And I found then, when I was watching the legislators on closed circuit TV online, people had my packet of stories on their desk. And so that was super powerful to realize I have helped take this message from all these nurses and midwives and so on and get it in an approachable, digestible form. And that bill did pass. And I'm super happy to know that I was a little part of it. And now in that state, I have 2 friends who are nurse midwives who have their own business and do not need a collaborative physician and can do practice as they are trained within their scope, partly because of the work of this giant group of people over 9 to 12 years. But I played a little role in it, and I couldn't be happier. It's one of my proudest achievements.
Yeah, I think it makes a big difference when people can realize they get so frustrated on a little guy level, like, I want to do this in my business. I want these rights to a hospital. I want to be able to not have to worry about a physician or a collaboration. It's these little things that make a big difference long-term for everybody. If we can pull together our resources and expertise, like everybody's background, everybody's not just a midwife. Everybody has a unique passion and skill, and what can we do to pull those together? So I love that story. Thank you.
Oh yeah, thanks. And my husband is a chiropractor. When we moved back to our restrictive Midwestern state that's restrictive for midwives, it was also restrictive for chiropractors. And he's not involved in legislative stuff at all, but some other chiropractors improved the scope of practice in the state so that now chiropractors in the state where we live can practice full scope. Before in this state, they were restricted to only adjusting the spine, and now they can adjust extremities, which, hands and arms and legs, hands and feet, which is something chiropractors are trained to do. And I think it's such a good analogy. Midwives are barred from doing what we do, and chiropractors are barred from doing what they do, and it makes no sense.
Yeah, any alternative therapies, I think, have just the competition, the barriers, there's a lot of things at play, but we can group together. I know certified professional midwives all over the country have really worked well with their clients and getting organizations formed. We just have to get nurse midwives a little bit more on board with what certified professional midwives are doing.
Yes, no, I hope to touch more on that later.
Yes,
What
we will.
Midwives can learn from certified professional midwives. Yeah,
we definitely will. So the next question on the list is, why is it so important for midwives to advocate for full scope and independent business practice rights? I know we touched on it briefly, but I would love to hear your answer.
Yeah, so I mean, going back to my example of the slightly more southern state than the Midwestern state where I live now, and Leslie and I are being a little vague about states because they want to emphasize the universality of these issues in the United States, and so that's why we're not singling out individual states. But here, so I have 2 good friends who have their own midwifery practices in the state where I worked so hard with the group for full practice authority. And it means everything to me that they can be there doing that, because one of them, for example, previously had to have a collaborative physician in order to exist. And I had a very poor opinion of her collaborative physician, and actually she did too, but that was what she had to do in order to serve the clients she wanted to serve. So it makes so much sense that she's not restricted that way anymore. And the other midwife friend, her business is expanding by leaps and bounds. She's got another midwife working with her now. She has a very great business sense, and she's so visible, and she's doing so much for our profession as well as for her clients. And it's just fantastic to know that the barriers for her are removed.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a big touching on point. Just historically, midwives have served women for thousands and thousands of years. And when it is a business sense, I mean, if you want to choose to work for a hospital setting and be employed, that's fine. But most midwives have this drive to serve women to our full extent in a simpler setting, a personalized setting, really follow a mission and values. And that's part of that autonomy. If there's restrictions that on your licensure and your scope, you're going to alter your business or your practice scope based on those those barriers at play. And I think that's a good chunk. I talk often in my videos, midwifery burnout and lack of advocacy and autonomy are why we're only 1 to 3% of the population. I think we could be a lot more if we had some of these things changed for us.
Yes, and I think, I think there are so many universals, like if you are a midwife employed in a hospital, instead of just realizing, I have a stressful job, I have a high volume, I have to appease physicians in many cases. If you also think, well, you know what, I am a midwife and there are midwives all across the country and the world, and what can I do in my little sphere to help those other midwives? And you may not have much idea what birth center or home birth midwives could benefit from your advocacy, but what you have, if you are in that kind of setting, is you have access to physicians and you work closely with them. And so by your, you will, every hospital employed midwife I've ever heard of has had, been sitting at the nurse's call station, for example, and heard the story of, oh, did you hear about some home birth transfer? And it's a really good time to jump in and talk about, oh, well, here are the, home birth guidelines, and here's what's evidence-based about home birth, and be able to present a positive approach to it. And if you don't know the information, get accurate information from your state ACNM affiliate, from, different online websites from national groups. So instead of succumbing to the temptation to like bash some other credential of midwife, I ask that you not do that, because what the public hears when that happens is just, oh, midwives are bashing midwives. Midwives can't even support each other. You will not usually see physicians engaging in that. And so by being the vast majority of midwives in this country are nurse midwives, and the vast majority of those are employed in a hospital setting, and you really have a lot of ability to help the rest of us. And supposing, I know so many midwives who are have their own practice now, but they were formerly employed in a hospital. And once they've started their own practice, they've become aware of just how many limitations there might be in a state. Of course, there are some states with almost no limitations. So if you are a hospital midwife feeling really secure, just think about 10 years from now. Maybe you want to have your practice look differently. And what can you do now to help grow the profession for all of us?
Yeah, and that kind of hints into your next question on our list. Why is it so important to work with your midwifery organization just instead of tackling it on your own? Because I think we feel so overwhelmed. Sometimes I think especially being a little bit of a nurse midwife that does out of hospital in our area, you don't quite fit, like you feel like you fit in one organization, but you don't quite feel like you fit in another organization. So sometimes it's a little overwhelming, feeling like the little guy squeezed between these two different philosophies. How does one midwife support and feel like, where does she find the connections for the great groups and organizations wanting to help together?
Well, I think that's such a great question, and I know that within my state ACNM affiliate, I for years felt like the outlier, and felt like I didn't belong, and had even as I mentioned, when I volunteered to go serve the state nursing organization, I had to check and make sure that it was okay to be my kind of nurse midwife and go represent nurse midwives, and that's a sad thing. But I've worked through it and have made alliances with, as you were very aware too, nurse midwives who work outside of a hospital tend to know each other and network. And I would say, sadly, a lot of them aren't in ACNM, which could do a lot of good if all nurse midwives and certified midwives joined it. So let's see. I think I lost my thread here, Leslie.
We were just talking about just the what can a little midwife do, joining an organization, being affiliated, even if it's just a membership, and keeping up with the emails and blogs. You gave some great examples last week of simple things, like videos when they're suggested.
Exactly. Thank you. Simple things like that. So, I know many practices where 10% of, like say large midwifery practices, 30 midwives, and they have 3 ACNM members. And I found by approaching the ACNM members in those practices, they feel kind of at odds with their practice mates, practice colleagues, because you have a few midwives saying it's really important to pay attention to the national organization and be aware of my scope, be aware of ACNM standards, be aware of ACNM legislative efforts. And you have the rest of the midwives apparently saying that that's not important to them. And I could tell you that in so many cases when I've become aware of practices like that, then something happens in the practice, like a chunk of midwives are carved out and told, well, you're going to be strictly a laborist and you are going to be strictly office. And now you're not a full scope midwife anymore. And that is actually, it could be a divide and conquer technique. Now the midwives aren't all seeing each other anymore. And so, the administration can try doing things. Now maybe we're going to decide that our hospitalist midwives no longer can attend VBAC.
Yeah.
So it is so important to stay connected to your professional organization so that you're aware of what is going on a national and state basis so that you can help. And sure, not everybody feels called to do this kind of work, but the absolute rock bottom bare minimum could be joining your professional organization, because at least then your money is going to help legislative efforts. Your money is going to committees that will develop standards and enforce standards and do the work.
Well, and I think it's just nice, the blogs, the emails that come, you are kept in the loop of potential changes, or maybe you're really passionate about something that comes up and you're like, oh my gosh, they're working on this and they're asking for videos. Spend 5 minutes doing an informal video with your phone and download it. Like, there's little things we can do, keeping involved. If you're on the outside, like, we can go on all sorts of topics, but I think just being on the sidelines, even if you don't want to get actively involved, being aware of what your organizations, MANA, ACNM, AABC, all the wonderful things these national organizations and international organizations are doing to help out midwifery, you can spread the word. You can talk to your colleagues and say, oh my gosh, they're doing this at the state level. I want to go and support, or I'm going to write a letter to my local representative. There's little things that make a big impact.
Yeah, so that's so true. And also adding to that list of midwifery organizations, I would say NACPM, the National Association of Certified Professional Midwives. And in my state where I live currently, we did our own version of a legislative request. ACNM made one of their quarterly requests for go meet with the legislator. In this case, it was virtual. And it was allegedly, or the main reason for the ask was to support a bill which is known as the Midwives for Moms Act. MOMS stands for Maximizing Optimal Maternity Services. It's one of these typical federal bills that gets a catchy name so that people will remember it. But this bill is really exciting because it will fund education both for direct entry midwives, which is the two credentials of direct entry midwives in the US are certified midwives who can be ACNM members, and then certified professional midwives who can be NACPM or MANA members. And then it will also fund education for nurse midwives. And it focuses on midwives from underserved communities and schools serving those midwives. So it's a way to address the maternal mortality crisis. It's a way to diversify midwifery. It's so exciting. And I realized that it made actually no sense to go meet with a legislator and just bring ACNM members. And so the other ACNM member who was organizing this, she and I reached out to our local CPM group, which in our state is not affiliated with NACPM or MANA. It is an independent group for CPMs. And they sent a member, and all of us lived in the same legislative district, and we compared talking points beforehand. We also combined it with an ask about birth centers, because that's very germane to nurse midwives and to CPMs. We don't have CMs in the state where I live. And so we realized this was a pioneering effort. This was midwives across the credentials working off of one organization, but combining requests from several. And it was so effective to talk with this legislator and just be a united front for midwifery. So it was really exciting. And it was like the aha moment. And of course, I am the Vice President for Government Affairs of American Association of Birth Centers, and we have midwives from all the credentials. CMs, of course, are a tiny group, and they're a tiny group in our group also, but a fair amount of CMs, certified midwives, do work in birth centers. So within ACNM, we routinely have different credentials of midwives working on the same project, and it makes so much sense. So I was glad to spread that effort to an ACNM effort and help move midwifery forward that way. And all of us on the call were just so excited.
Yeah, well, and I think it's similar to when ACNM and ACOG started and AAP started joining as national organizations. When we start pooling our resources, even though we've got slightly different educational backgrounds, our core, our mission, our value is healthy moms and babies. So if we can refocus our mission on I think, I found the states that have a midwifery board versus segregated, they make bigger changes because there's a bigger power of midwife versus different classifications. So I agree with you 100%.
Yeah, so that's such I truly hope that for generations forward, we will have one credential of midwife in this state. And for example, in Washington state, which is often held up as the ideal state for CPMs to practice in, part of CPM's scope is basic GYN care. And how much sense that makes. Of course, they know a cervix as well as any other midwife. So moving forward, that is something I fervently hope for the profession. And as you said, it's probably going to be the newer generations driving that, not us.
The young feisty ones that know how hard they worked for school and what they can offer to women. So yes, I think change is happening, especially with all the backdrop changes, crisis. You can look at a positive opportunity to make changes and get access to resources that you always have to be positive.
Yes, exactly. No, and I'm not young anymore, but certainly feisty, and I plan to do this work for a good long time to come. And I'm
Yeah.
thrilled when I get to share a little bit of learning with people who are coming up, and then they can take off and go in their own legislative direction.
Yeah, pass your knowledge and wisdom, and we'll keep up all our energy for you.
Yeah, right, exactly. Pass the knowledge and wisdom and explain some of the weird, legislative things. Like when somebody just says to me, "Oh, that bill is triple referred," I think, well, why?
I don't know what you just said to me, so that's a perfect example.
Exactly. No, and it's like so it's like anything else in midwifery. We need to, when we're teaching people, explain what those things are, and it can be a way of otherizing people. Like, I have all this knowledge and I'm not going to share it with you.
Yeah.
Or let me tell you what triple referred means. It means it's going to go to 3 different legislative committees. And boom, then
remind me after this is done recording, because we'll brainstorm a blog where we can put all these acronyms down that people can resource later, like government acronyms or verbiage that midwives aren't familiar with. I can see a great blog post coming from that. So.
Yeah, no, I actually, I'm still a freelance editor, and one of my favorite things is editing political columns for different papers, for different trade organizations, because it's so exciting for me to think about what I know about making politics understandable for midwives, and now I can help do that for engineers and architects and so on.
Very cool. Very cool. So the next question is, what states, in your opinion, are better for independent midwifery practice? So say I'm young, I'm single, I don't have any kids yet, I can go anywhere in the country. Where would you recommend, if you're looking for more autonomy in business and practicing rights, what would be the states you would recommend?
Washington State is great for CPMs, and for CNMs, it doesn't license CMs yet, certified midwives yet. So if you are a CPM or a CNM, Washington State is probably a fantastic place to be. Minnesota is pretty good also. Not having practiced on the West Coast as a midwife, I know that in general, the West Coast states are really good for midwives. California is terrible for nurse midwives. It requires outright physician supervision. A physician has to look at a certain percentage of charts. So California is held up as a really bad place for nurse midwives, but is a good place for CPMs. So I think it will be so fantastic decades from now, we can just say the whole country is a great country for midwifery. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely got spoiled as being a new graduate going to Alaska for an adventure, because it sets the tone when you get a more autonomous state to practice, and then you want to move back home to where you're from in the Midwest. You think, my skills and knowledge didn't change, but it sets you a different mental picture when you get to practice somewhere that's more autonomous, and then you just decide to move. You feel very restricted, even though nothing had changed you. It's interesting. So
yeah, and it's interesting because in looking at Facebook groups of nurse midwives and nurse practitioners and so on, I guess some people aren't having that as an expectation. Maybe they probably always practiced as a nurse in restrictive states. But I find, for example, I saw a student nurse midwife posting something like, "Oh, it didn't seem that bad having the physician supervision." And I think probably she's not an ACNM member. Probably her preceptor isn't an ACNM member. But possibly these nurse midwives, if there are any where she works, aren't ACNM members. And it's, all of us should feel chafing when we can't practice as a profession without some other profession being in charge of us in some way. It's insulting, unnecessary, and not linked to any kind of good patient outcomes.
Yeah, but if you've only seen one side of things, we can talk about cultural differences and all these different aspects, because if you don't know, you don't understand. And that's where I think it's so important for CNMs and CPMs to go to meetings together, to learn about each other and get a better understanding. And even just midwives in the hospital setting, birth center, home setting, having more blogs and having more joint collaborations and understanding each other is going to drastically improve it. Because if you only live in your own little sheltered community, you're not going to understand each other and the barriers and the strengths and the possibilities that can be with midwifery of choices. So
yes, no, and that's one of the things that I love most about AABC, American Association of Birth Centers, is we are for all midwives, and we're for birth center owners and birth center nurses and doulas, and not all birth centers have nurses. I didn't mean to imply that they did.
You didn't. I didn't hint at it at all. Nope.
Oh, good, but it's not a us versus them approach at all, and that's what I want for the whole country. And I think you're so right. It's a cultural thing, and I think it's so fantastic that you, with your entrepreneurial drive, went to go work in Alaska as a new grad, because that became your norm. And then you move back to our unfortunate Midwestern state, which has more barriers to nurse midwives than
If
any
my
other
family wasn't all here, that's the driving force. But everybody learns their passion. Like your passion is governmental affairs. And I found after running my own practice for years that I like business and taxes and legal and regulatory things that help make that financial knowledge that's not in school. I found my niche. I found my passion. How can I help midwives? Like I want to support women. And so, yes, I agree wholeheartedly. Let's use all of our passions and drives. We're all midwives, but we all have our unique aspect of midwifery to serve. So.
Yes, no, and it's so true because your passion and mine really dovetail well because I'm passionate about improving the regulatory and legislative climate, and that will then free up space for birth centers and midwives having their own practices and so on, and midwives having their own practice and owning their practice and making a living from their practice, not having to pay a physician, not being restricted. So they really go together nicely.
Yeah, nope, I agree 100%. So the next question it's tailing into, so we talked about all these great states to practice in. So if you're somebody that has flexibility in moving and you're considering starting your own practice or wanting more autonomy, what states would you recommend typically avoiding and not having top at your list?
Yeah, well, so I mentioned a couple, one bad one at least, which is California for nurse midwives is a problem. Although, for example, there's a few states like Michigan, for example, doesn't let nurses own a business essentially. California does let nurse midwives. There's a thing called a nurse-owned corporation, I think. So nurse midwives can own a business in California, like a birth center or a home birth practice, but then they have to have physician supervision. So it's like a good, bad thing. But Ohio is very problematic because it's one of the states where nurse midwives and the other advanced practice nurses can't even be given a license as such without a physician signing, like, I will supervise this person. So you would definitely want to avoid Ohio if you're a nurse midwife looking to have a business. Ohio doesn't license CPMs, and so in states that don't license CPMs, there's always that danger of a CPM being accused of practicing medicine without a license.
You want to go into the term illegal? Because I always hear people talk about illegal, legal, and illegal. I would love to hear your
that's
perspective.
A good point. Yeah, so no, it's an unfortunate thing. So illegal means against the law. So for example, if you are a state that licenses CPMs and requires that somebody need to have a license as a midwife to practice, you have to have a license as a nurse midwife or a license as a CPM. And then you are calling yourself a midwife and you don't have one of those licenses, you are now illegal. But if you're in a state like the 15 or so states that don't license CPMs and you are practicing as a CPM, it is illegal, A meaning non. It is not illegal, it's not legal, it's in that gray area. And can be an unfortunate position to be in. And then we all know what legal means, right?
Yeah, I agree. Any other states you can think of on the list? I know the last one we discussed was Ohio.
Yeah, let's see. I was trying to look up today what, for CMs, I know that this may have changed, but I just want to mention briefly that CMs were licensed in only about 5 states, and the few states that did license them tended to be restrictive of what they could do. New York is ideal for CNMs and CMs, and there's a board of licensed midwifery, and so nurse midwives and CMs in that state earn the designation LM, standing for licensed midwife. And it's like you said, a board of midwifery is such an ideal thing rather than nurse midwives being regulated by a board of nursing, or there's a minority of states where nurse midwives are regulated by a board of medicine. There's some unfortunate states where they're regulated by both. Their nursing credential is regulated by the board of nursing, and then their CNM credential is license is regulated by a board of medicine.
Well, and I think going back to your point, if you're already established as a midwife, you have to figure out the state. But if you're considering to become a midwife, it's a big decision because there's so many paths for education, and every path has autonomy and barrier restrictions for each state. So I always wonder how a midwife contemplates becoming a midwife and the thought process, because there's so much to think about. It's a big decision if you're going to choose to be a direct entry, a traditional, a CPM, a CM, a CNM. So I would we'll do another blog in a month or two to pick your brain about the educational decision makings, let alone we're already practicing midwives.
Well, and I'll just say that, I mean, that was definitely something that I thought about, because when I first realized I wanted to be a midwife, it was before the CPM credential existed. And I had a birth with a midwife and realized, I want to be a midwife. I thought that only meant nurse midwife, so I pursued that. And then I went to nursing school and worked as a nurse for a number of years. And because my husband was going to chiropractic school, and we were staggering the education so that somebody could still earn a living. So before I went to nurse midwife school, I had a deep introspective writing, journaling process where I went, what do I want? I knew I didn't like this hospital dominant model, but by then we had the CPM credential, but CPMs weren't getting paid by insurance. And I had always felt drawn to work with inner city populations. And that's still my biggest love of patients I like to work with. So I thought, well, realistically, I can get paid as a midwife to work in the inner city and get Medicaid and so on. So I went that route. But I mean, there are many, many days when I think, how cool to be a both,
Yeah.
which is not necessarily a good option because then you're bound by two sets of regulations.
Yeah, and you usually get the restrictive of the two, not the autonomy of the two.
Exactly. Yeah. Doubly restricted. Gee, that sounds fun. Yeah.
So
I know
that
would be a great topic for a future discussion is, how do people choose?
Yeah, they're considering to be a midwife. I think we could have a great talk about that for the aspiring midwives out there.
Yeah.
So the last question on our list has to do with what else can I or other individual midwives, we briefly talked about it, but I want you to go more in depth, help and promote midwifery as a whole on a state level in your community and on a national level?
That's a great question. I'm glad we wrote it. One of the things I notice often with midwives is I'm a city election official, and when I'm logged into our platform, I can see who's on the day of the election, I can see who's voted and who hasn't, and I'm constantly chagrined to know I live in a city with a lot of midwives, and there's a lot of non-voting midwives, and that's really galling because when you go see a legislator and you tell them, hey, I represent, blah, 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 midwife group, and we have 10 midwives in your district. Well, the legislator can look at people's voting record. And if they see non-voting midwives, how motivated do you think they are going to be? Because, to be realistic, legislative is often, I'll scratch your back, you'll scratch mine. I'll march in your parade, and then you'll get nice footage of midwives and us carrying signs like midwives for Senator so-and-so, and then you'll vote for our bill. And you have a lot less to offer if you are showing that your constituency is not voting. So,
well, everything's negotiation, everything's creating a win-win. And when you're talking to politicians and you're wanting to get change to happen, you have to always think any conversation we ever have, it's a powerful tool. If you can say, okay, this is what I want, I need to figure out what they want, and let's merge our two options together.
Yes, exactly. No, I mean, when I go to politicians and say, I live 2 districts over from you, but I've caught 16 babies of moms who live in your district, boing, ears up, they're all about that. And that's been so powerful. And so it's definitely an awareness of what you can do for them and they can do for you. So registering to vote and voting is really important. Being a member of a professional organization, as we've discussed, it is important to at least give them your money and try to follow their websites, follow their blogs, open your email a couple times a week and see if they're asking you to do something.
Well, even the funds, like you said, even if you don't do anything but donate to that professional organization, those funds go to advocating for you. And so
yes,
I think there's a lot of importance level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And maybe you're having a week where you just can't look at email, and then later on some other midwife you work with says, hey, did you send that email to Senator so-and-so? I did, which I wish that were kind of conversation midwives. We should be having that conversation. And maybe you feel bad that you missed that effort, but you can remind yourself to be alert for the next time around. So the other thing is being educated about your profession. I mean, it doesn't look good for the midwifery profession, for any of the professions, when a physician, for example, asks us about, are nurse midwives allowed to do something? And the nurse midwife isn't aware of ACNM standards, scope of practice, state regulations, anything like that. It's a sad situation if you know so little about your profession that you rely on others to tell you what you can and can't do. Like I run into nurse midwives who think, nurse midwives can't attend VBAC. Well, that's not true at all. Yeah. Or, so ACNM has a process by which we can add quote unquote like extra skills like circumcision or limited ultrasound and so on. But I've run into many midwives who just start doing that on their own, or a physician told them to, so they think it's okay. And that doesn't look good for the profession either, because you have to realize when you're a minority profession like midwives, everything you do is going to have an effect on other midwives, even indirectly. And, if a midwife in the state has a bad outcome, we all know the bad outcomes can happen in maternity care. Nobody is guaranteed anything, but we've all seen over and over again, if a bad outcome happens outside of a hospital, it's got to be either the fault of the midwife or the fault of the setting. Home births are bad, or birth center births are bad. If something happens in a hospital, it tends to be staff made every attempt they could, and things went bad anyhow. So being aware of what the state guidelines are, what the national guidelines are, and so on, and not bashing other midwives. So when it might be tempting to say, oh, there was a home birth and the mother hemorrhaged and almost lost her life, don't immediately jump in and start bashing the other midwives. You're not helping by doing that, because trust me, somebody will come around and bash you as well, and may take away your
Well, and
ability
it's
to
taking out
that.
stereotypes. Like we are taught as care providers not to stereotype our patients. Why are we stereotyping each other professionally? And so it's getting back to the core of ethics and getting back to the core of, we all went back into this. Maybe your style of midwifery is a little bit different and you have different beliefs and cultural background, but that's okay. That's what strengthens us as a whole.
Yes.
So we have to shift our minds that we take care of all aspects of patients, and we have midwives that take care of all aspects of cultural backgrounds, beliefs, and we all have our strengths when we learn from each other. So getting that mind shift. Mm-hmm.
No, that's an excellent mindset. And it's, and this also requires a lot of nurse midwives needing to trust CPM's knowledge. CPMs are specifically educated for community birth, meaning home and birth center birth. And so a lot of nurse midwives would have no idea what to do if they walked into a home or a birth center.
Yeah.
And CPMs might have no idea what to do if they walked into a hospital and the mom had an epidural and all these lines running. So, we've all got a piece of midwifery and need to assume positive intent, I think, is really important. And when things go bad, don't circle the wagons and shoot inward. Present a united front, like so many other professions are good at doing.
Yeah, perfect. I think that's a great way to end our talk today, Moira. Yeah. So I'm so grateful that you're on, and I will definitely let you know if there's questions people send to me and things that come up and ways. The biggest thing I think is just getting in touch with their local organization and the reps and being able to say, okay, this is what I'm passionate about. What are you guys working on? What can I help with is the biggest thing I would encourage midwives to do.
I would so encourage that as well. And yeah, I'm happy to answer questions that people send to you by email, and I'd love to have a dialogue. If you think you want to do more legislative work, I can certainly talk with you, connect you with people, and it's really important to keep this work going.
Okay. Well, thank you very, very much, Moira. I appreciate your time.
I appreciate your time, Leslie. It was a pleasure. Have a great day.